Ani, bonjour, everybody. My name is Bailey Walkie. I'm the founder of Frayed Feathers and the host of the Frayed Feathers podcast. I support teams to create youth reconciliation strategies, and I make this podcast to inform Indigenous youth responses across Canada. And so today we're going to be talking about my bread and butter, which is youth reconciliation strategies, why they're important, how the heck do you make them, what's the most important content that needs to be part of it, and yeah, just kind of everything all around. And I'll probably make a podcast about this topic in a couple different ways, just because strategy is so important to reconciliation work. And, like government and nonprofits, um, really in regards to like supporting people and the public sector, et cetera, like are very strapped for resources. And so it's very important for us to become good strategists because we need to accent or um for lack of a better term, just like get the most out of what we have. And so strategies do that. They focus in the attention. They create a clear pathway for people to use the little amount of resources they have for like the largest amount of impact. So but before we get into all that, I want to tell you about why I'm the person to tell you about this. So, firstly, I'm 27. I've been working with youth since I was 15, and I started as a dance teacher. I then went into social work and did youth restorative justice, and now I work as a youth policy analyst. And so I bring these skill sets together in Frayed Feathers to support teams to create these youth reconciliation strategies. And so I feel like I have had the privilege to not only deeply understand like the youth experience, just by not only being a young person myself, but also working with young people through their trials and tribulations. And, in regards to strategy development, I feel like, or I have been part of all aspects of the strategy. So like whether it be in the youth advisory council or being on a steering committee, or being or chairing that steering committee. And now, in my current position, I lead the development of strategies, just like effectively as a project manager. And so there's so many things that go into it. But nonetheless, all those things, in addition to me just being a total flippin' nerd, like I love like watching strategy videos, I attend webinars, I'm listening to leaders, I read reconciliation action plans, like I enjoy learning about the craft because as someone who's worked in our not in but perhaps around government systems for so long, whether it be the court system or the public housing system, in my previous position as a restorative justice worker, my job was like kind of to support people with their care plans, and their care plans are always relevant to so many different care systems. And so I got a strong dose of an introduction to all these different types of care systems. And, not only in my position now working with teams directly to like create reconciliation strategies, but also just like in getting up to this point, always working with teams who are kind of at the mercy of the strategies that are created by leadership. And some of these strategies read more like plans, and they don't provide like a clear direction, like an actual strategic direction. It's just like things we want to do in the next little bit. And these teams like have no idea how to do that. And like they're kind of like, well, they're an entry level position. They're expecting to receive direction. So it only makes sense for us as the people implementing the work to learn what a good strategy actually is and what's going to be effective for us to receive as knowledge workers so that we can carry out that not only like in like to get the most bang for our buck, so to speak, and like achieve good social outcomes, but also like, within what the leadership wants us to do, right? Like it's important for all of us to be aligned from the top bottom. And that's what strategies do. It's like an exercise in like centralized power, right? And so we're going to get into that. I'm going to grab this sip of water. That is good stuff. Okay. So, number one, first section, why it matters. So, firstly, kind of what I'm witnessing as a young Indigenous person working in the public sector is that the reconciliation mandate, I feel, is moving away from a government mandate and is being more understood as like a Canadian mandate. And so, how this kind of gets, um, I guess, like kind of what that looks like is corporates, small businesses, really like all scales of business, institutions as well, are starting to identify like where they fit into a reconciliation approach, or solution. And so we all play a part in it, right? Like, so like colonization was so disastrous for indigenous people that there is just endless things that we could support indigenous people on. But that's kind of where, sometimes there can be a misunderstanding of what indigenous communities want or need. And I think that we're definitely at risk of doing, like handout like responses, meaning like, oh, here's some money, you know what I mean? We tore up your land and now like the salmon's not in the river anymore. It's like, well, like, I don't know if that's really what those indigenous people would have wanted, or like is actually effective or like feels good to do and whatever. And so anyway, like it's really important for us to understand this because it's going to be something that we all need to flex our skills on, and like how do we fit into the reconciliation thing or into the mandate. And so like this is a complex problem, like like if you really think about it, it's kind of crazy to ask like, thousands of people in the form of like a corporation or an institution or something to solve a problem, and like all and expect them all to like be able to work together and like figure it out, and and actually like balance their perspectives and things like that. Like humans as groups, we make settlements, you know what I mean? Like if I took 10 of your friends and was like, go make a bushcraft fort or something like that, like they would figure it out, you know what I mean? They would create a system and whatever. But like we're not dealing with that level of problem. We're dealing with an exponentially more complex problem, than a practical thing of creating a shelter, right? So strategies are a way to create that strong coordinated response amongst all these different people. And, I think just because, this is a shift, right? This is not like it's not we've not arrived at a position where like, you know, all Canadian corporates have like accepted the mandate of reconciliation, right? Like most of these companies, whether like big or small, have never made a reconciliation strategy, let alone a youth reconciliation strategy, which is my specialty. Like youth is such an misunderstood demographic when it comes to the support system, not only because like they're young and like everything's changing and the world is changing and young people are changing and all that, but also like our care systems are just behind, right? Like even like if you look at the education system, the healthcare system, like there is like innovations happening all the time, but like to see those innovations implemented into the actual system, that takes so much longer, right? And so like the so just like the state of youth supports is just like it's really hard to catch up, you know what I mean? And so anyway, so what I'm getting at is that it's an especially complex situation when you talk about this demographic being youth specifically. And then lastly, I touched on this a little bit earlier, is that like teams can only be as effective as the strategic direction they've received from leadership. And so, what I feel like I've witnessed a lot, working in and around government and just the public sector, is that there's these objectives, I guess, but not a clearly outlined approach to do it. And I don't mean like clear approaches in like a step by step action. Like you do this, then this, and then this, and then all these things will happen. Although that is a small part of it. Also, just like creating the guardrails, like of like the types of solutions that one would want to move forward on. Like if you just tell me like, hey, I want to solve youth homelessness, well, there's a lot of ways we could do that, right? We could give everybody a house. Okay, boom, you're all solved. We could move them out of sight, ooh, okay, you know what I mean? Now you've just created a problem somewhere else. You could give them all money, just like here's so much money that you couldn't possibly not be housing yourself. You know what I mean? Like, or we can try to bring them on an education journey and like get them all jobs and like support them to the effect in which they can support themselves by the end of it or something like that. There's so many different solutions, but if leadership doesn't tell you what kind of solutions they want you to work on, well, you're now asking an entry level position, someone who doesn't have all the resources and the privy information that leadership has, to essentially do whatever it is they think is going to be good. You know what I mean? And then the leadership, like, if they don't stay, if they're not directing you for the type of solution you want, and you're going to move forward on the solution that you want to do, well, they might not actually like that. You know what I mean? And they might like shoot it down like once it's like halfway done through, or like maybe I don't know, maybe they have a eureka moment and then they come to you like, oh yeah, by the way, I know you've been working 2 months on this thing that we essentially forced you to find a solution for. Well, now we want you to do this. It's like, so anyway, so, all this to say, it's really important that there's folks like yourselves that are listening to this podcast and me blabber a little bit at you so that I can save you time, money, and hopefully a little bit of headaches to clear up this strategy, some of these strategy components. Okay, so let's go to the next one. So, what is a strategy? So, youth reconciliation strategies are just one type of strategy, and every strategy has fundamentals. And if they're missing, then it's going to be not disastrous, but well, it's going to be missing. There's going to be a clear gap, and you're going to have gaps in performance. We don't want that. And so, we need to consider that a strategy is a form of problem solving, and you wouldn't create a solution that has gaps, or you wouldn't create a plan that has gaps because you're not solving the problem. Then you're just solving parts of the problem, which might actually make it worse. So yeah, you just need to be very mindful of that. Of that is the core function of a strategy. And so by identifying the key facts and problems for the thing that we're having, the problem that we're experiencing, like youth homelessness or something, excuse me, we can create a focused response. I talked earlier about strategies and exercise and centralized power. You know what I mean? Like, it's coordinating all these different people to reach a goal. Excuse me, I'm so burpy. I don't know if it's because I'm just like, whenever I just start talking fast or passionate or something, I get burpy, but I notice I burp on this podcast all the time. And like when I do presentations. Anyway, I'm talking to myself. So, I have one of the books I've been reading recently is called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy: The Difference and Why It Matters. And it is by Richard Rumelt. And it's not so much about like a guide, like this is how you do it step by step. It's more about kind of like a mindset in that this is exactly what a strategy is. These are the core elements and like what they need to contain, but it's more telling you the what, not the how, right? And so I want to read a little page out of here because I think that this one section really was kind of like the eureka moment in this book for me. And yeah, I just feel like it would be helpful for folks to hear it. So here we go. So, good strategy is coherent action backed up by an argument, an effective mixture of thought and action with a basic underlying structure I call the kernel. Kernel as in like a popcorn kernel. Or a corn kernel, duh. A good strategy may consist of more than the kernel, but if the kernel is absent or misshapen, that's funny, then there is a serious problem. Once you apprehend this kernel, it is much easier to create, describe, and evaluate a strategy. The kernel is not based on any one concept or of advantage. It does not require one to sort through legalistic gibberish about the differences between vision, mission, goals, strategies, objectives, and tactics. It does not split strategies into corporate, business, and product levels. It is very straightforward. The kernel of a strategy contains three elements. Number one, a diagnosis that defines or explains the nature of the challenge. A good diagnosis simplifies the often overwhelming complexity of reality by identifying certain aspects of the situation as critical. Number two, guiding policy. This is my favorite. For dealing with the challenge, this is an overall approach chosen to cope with or overcome the obstacles identified in the diagnosis. And number three, a set of coherent actions that are designed to carry out the guiding policy. These are steps that are coordinated with one another to work together in accomplishing the guiding policy. And so today on this podcast, I kind of want to just talk about these three components: the diagnosis, the guiding policy, and the coherent actions, because the more I understood the kernel, as Richard puts it, I felt like I was able to. It brought me a new lens whenever I read strategies. Okay, and this whole book, like Richard Rumel is like very successful business strategist. I believe they are a professor at Harvard School of Business. And they do like amazing work, and they make so many references in here, not only to like they don't make references to like small scale operations. Like they're talking about like some of the largest banks in the world, or talking about national security and like the military strategies, and like how they lack these components of like the kernel, you know and so I talk a lot about it talks a lot about how I and this book talk a lot about like it's the focus for leadership to build out strategy, right? And I just want to make it clear, like before I kind of like move forward into kind of like where we get it wrong and stuff like that, because we always got to start with the challenges here. Um, is that I don't think that it's fair to be like, oh, like leadership made a crap strategy, and now we're not going to get anything done, or like they're incompetent because they can't make a strategy. Like um, the more and more I learn about strategy, the more I realize it's like an additional skill. Like it's definitely an upskill. Like if you can make a strategy, like an actual good strategy, like dude, like you will soar in leadership positions. Like no matter the scale. You know, and so anyway, the point is that like companies usually hire consultants to like do strategy work. Like it's not really, it's more about the leadership bringing the mind, because they have like the expertise, they are privy to the relationships that they have, like information that like they can draw from those relationships, right? The public sector is very small, and so they bring that skill set, that solution in their brain, and then the consultant will essentially work with them to create, to put it into a deliverable, like something that can be understood by their staff and stuff like that, right? So like I talk a lot about like my experience working with teams that are at the mercy of like poop strategies, quite frankly, and they don't know what to do about it. But I also like want to be clear that I don't think that it's like totally on the leadership either. Like sometimes you just kind of have to work with what you got, and like in the public sector, like to ask an organization to fork out tens of thousands of dollars to create a strategy with somebody may not be their priority, although it could have a very high return on investment. A lot of these nonprofits are working from a state of crisis, like very reactionary. And I would say government is the same way. Like they're very reactionary. They know what's going on. It's just not really a priority until like the public starts hounding them about it, right? And like that's usually whenever it becomes a crisis, or something really bad has happened and whatever. And so anyway, I just wanted to make that clear. Like I think it's important to be strength based here, and like I don't think it's like effective to like be resentful to your leadership because they don't like make good strategies. Like I think it's just more important for us to educate ourselves about what a strategy is, how good it is, and if we require strategy from our leadership, then we can ask them to do it in a way that is helpful for all of us, right? Like we got to help our leadership help us, and I think that that's kind of the angle I want to take with this. So yeah, anyway, so with that out of the way, So since it's a unique skill, it's easy to like misunderstand what strategy really is, right? And that's when I was talking about like plans. And that's the whole essence of this book. Like this is why it's called good strategy, bad strategy, because it demonstrates what bad strategy is and like how there's so much of it. So like let me give you an example. Like in the context of like serving young indigenous people, like you might see something in like a bad strategy that says like operations wants to start a new program for young people, or human resources wants to hire more talent, or the youth want to engage leadership level positions when they deliver their presentations. It's like, okay, well, those are all great plans or goals, but it's not, if we consider the kernel of good strategy, it doesn't have a diagnosis, right? It doesn't like tell us what the exact problem is. And so therefore, like, how do we know that this plan, this goal is actually going to be the solution that gets us there? So there's that. There's no guiding policy about like, okay, human resources wants to hire more talent, but how are they going to do that? Like, are you going to hire recruiters? Are you going to prioritize people doing this over other activities? Will you try to remove some sort of barrier? You know what I mean? Like you need to like put up these like very clear guiding policies in that context. And then yeah. And so anyway, I'm gonna go on to the next one. So we can move forward with these goals. Like it's not nothing. And I don't think that just because it's missing something, it's completely unhelpful. But we would be more effective as entry level positions to have stronger strategies, right? Okay, so let me give you a theoretical example of this. All right, so of like the kernel applied to some of these situations. So, or some of these examples. So here we have operations wants to start a new program to support more young people. Okay, so what a diagnosis will do is outline the needs of the young people and what that organization can offer. So when you assess the problem, it opens up the opportunity to see how other people have solved it, right? If you know exactly what your problem is, well, now you can look up reports and read research. You can buy books, like you can actually, um, what the heck you're trying to solve now, right? And it also allows the strategy that you create after the diagnosis to be revisited if and most likely when the circumstances change, especially with young people, right? It's always going to be you need to be very flexible. And so the goal here is to simplify a complex situation and call attention to the critical points. So you want to, like, if we consider youth homelessness as the problem, okay, well, now our diagnosis is like, okay, the youth are falling, are falling. Youth are, well, yeah, I guess falling through the cracks in the system or gaps in the system, as we say, and they're finding themselves on the street after they transition from government care. They just don't have the life skills to live independently, essentially, and so they find themselves experiencing homelessness. Okay, so we assess the problem. Um, and now it's like, okay, but our organization, we just offer employment supports. You know what I mean? Like you don't give them housing. You can't support them with mental health challenges. If they're using substances, that's something they need to support themselves with. Get to detox, go to the health clinic, go to treatment, etc. So you're in this situation where it's like, okay, well, these youth who are coming through our organization don't have the other supports to apply themselves appropriately to employment. You know what I mean? So like if you don't have like for example, if you don't have stability in your life, you don't have a place to sleep, you don't know when your next meal's coming, it's going to be pretty hard to be proactive about getting a job. And I know it sounds like, oh, well, just get a job, you'll have money then. It's like, okay, but like you don't have anywhere to shower, like you don't have multiple changes of clothing, like you likely don't have a phone that can keep charge. You're like have to go to the public library for your Wi-Fi, and like there's just like all these like very clear barriers that like if you just had a home, it would be so much easier. Like even if it was just like a bed and like a room or something. And so anyway, like a good diagnosis is about identifying what can be leveraged within our power to drive the change, right? So, like a single entity is unlikely to address a cultural or societal class issue, like youth experiencing homelessness. But we can leverage organizational functions like policies and operations, so it's like, okay, well, we're an employment agency for young people. They need stability in order to receive our to like receive our supports. So let's make policies to ensure that we partner with the people that can offer these core supports, so that the young people who come through our organization to receive employment supports are actually following through with the program, and they're completing it, and they're getting jobs, and they're doing all these kinds of things, right? So, like it a good diagnosis is going to like make it clear for you, like within your power, to address this very complex challenge, right? Like, and you kind of have to be okay with not being everything to everyone. You cannot be everything to everyone, like as much as we want to try and be those people, because that's just where our hearts are. You can't. And but what you can do is be the best at doing one thing. And in this example, if you're giving employment supports, you can act as like a liaison between all these other core supports that enable somebody to have very good results in your program. I need a drink of water. Right? So for example, like, if we just made a bad diagnosis and we said like, the culture around supporting young people sucks, like they don't have any supports, the government doesn't help them, all this stuff, and just like name off all these like poor things, like that's not going to be helpful for your staff. They need a diagnosis of something that you have control over, right? And so that's why it's important to not like think of your organization as like going to solve this cultural or socioeconomic challenge, and rather just like leverage your functions like policies and operations. Okay. So, okay, yeah, I love this line. The diagnosis is not about the societal challenges that lead to young people needing a nonprofit services. It's about identifying what can be leveraged internally to start the new program. So what do you have within your assets to do that? Okay, so let's move to the next one. Alrighty, and I'm back. Sorry, y'all. So my video completely cut out. I don't know what exactly caused it, but nonetheless, I kind of lost a little bit of time. I was talking for like close to 10 minutes without it recording. So I'm going to pick up where I think I was. Like it's a podcast, so it's kind of like free flowing. I do have some talking points, so like there's a semi structure to it. But anyway, let's get back into it. So I think where I was like lining off is or ending off was that a diagnosis is not about the societal challenges that lead young people to requiring nonprofit services. It's not about like saying like government sucks and like, oh, colonization was horrible, and so like all these indigenous youth are like, finding themselves experiencing homelessness and all this stuff. It's about identifying what can be leveraged internally to do a new thing, to start a new program, which was our example. Like you need to frame strategies as leveraging your operations and policies rather than like, well, we're gonna end youth homelessness. You know what I mean? Like that's a vision. That is not a strategy. And like your diagnosis of like you doing work, like I don't know, housing youth or something like that, is going to like lead to ending homelessness. Like it is just not effective to people, to the reader. You know what I mean? Reader meaning like your staff. Like it's they need very concrete. They need a diagnosis about the challenges in society, but the about how you fit into that challenge. Not so much about, we're gonna keep doing our core functions and eventually it'll work out. Like that's not how it is. Strategies are about your growth and how and outlining the clearer pathway to achieve those goals. Okay, so going into the next one, we have a guiding policy. Okay, so this is kind of like my favorite part of the whole thing, because you kind of get to some of your work is finally getting to pay off, right? You do all this diagnosis work, you're like thinking critically, and then the policies is like where you start thinking of solutions, right? It's kind of exciting. And so anyway, I'm going to read out from the book again, just to a little reminder about what a guiding policy is all about. So a guiding policy is for dealing with the challenge. This is an overall approach chosen to cope with or overcome the obstacles identified in the diagnosis. So it's guiding, quote unquote, because it doesn't say exactly what to do, but it keeps our minds focused on the types of solutions that this strategy needs. An example of a guiding policy might be, we're going to remove bureaucratic obstacles and interagency competition, or committing extra staff members to this even if it takes them away from important activities. These policies are acting as guardrails, so to speak, so that we don't get too off track in brainstorming solutions, right? Like I talked earlier about how you could end youth homelessness in a variety of ways, and all of them are going to have a different approach, right? So we don't want to overwhelm ourselves with solutions, so we put in these guiding policies. And so a different diagnosis of the situation will lead to different guiding policies. And so this is why it's so important to have a diagnosis, because I talked earlier about how like these situations are so complex, because they're human problems, human complexities. And so we need to set ourselves up to iterate as needed, because things change and what we're doing might be good, but we could do it even better. You know what I mean? Or maybe what we're doing actually is dog water and we want to do something at least average. You know what I'm saying? So, next point, Indigenous youth serving organizations have low resources. Okay, I know this very well from working in nonprofit my whole career. And, good strategies are about creating advantages that magnify the resources and actions of a nonprofit. So, like a strategy work, yes, it can kind of seem like a little bit of an upfront cost that's maybe unnecessary, because it's like, well, we're still going to operate our core functions despite not having a strategy. It's like, okay, but like if you magnified your resources and actions, you got more out of the work you're doing. Wouldn't that be a good thing, right? And like, how much is that really worth to you if you think about it? If you can support a young person at their age, at the age they are now, and set them up for success, how much are you saving the system in money, in emergency responses, in hospital stays, in all these different avenues, just by forking up some upfront money to create a strategy and get more out of your inputs. So these are questions that I think people need to be asking themselves. And certainly me as a young Indigenous person, I feel like I just witnessed a lot of teams who have really good hearts, like they want to support young people, etc., but they just, what I talked about earlier, just so reactive, right? Like, the state of the public sector is to be reactionary, and strategies are proactive. And so that's why it's so important to have like a different perspective, I guess. You know what I mean? Like, what can we do in the future? Anyway, back to policies. A guiding policy creates advantage by anticipating the actions and reactions of a sector, by reducing the ambiguity and complexity of the situation. So I talked earlier about how like it's up to leadership to absorb complexities, right? So like if we consider youth homelessness, as complex as hell, yo. And in my opinion, as a policy analyst, is that gaps in the system exist because we enable them to be in the system. Like we have policies which are meant to be like the authority in how things roll out, and those policies are not inclusive. And so, anyway, like that's me absorbing the complexity of the situation. Why do we have gaps in the system? Why do we have these problems? And saying, well, it's the policies. You got to focus on this specific thing. And and I know it's more than just the policies, but I'm one person. I can only do so much. And so as a strategy nerd, I know that like I need to do my best as a consultant to stay focused on what I can actually bring. What is my value to companies, and be honest about what my value proposition is to them, right? And so I've taken the complexity of youth reconciliation and said, this is how we focus on it, right? It's through policy. And so I've created processes that enable us to work within that sector to create these solutions, right? And so, like, imagine if I was like, oh, I have all this indigenous youth support and policy experience. Well, I actually think that supporting youth homelessness is actually going to be like to build them all homes. Well, I don't know how to build things, bro. You know what I mean? So I stick into what my type of solution is. And so, anyway, the anticipating of reactions and reactions can be a little bit difficult, like it is complex, etc. Complex meaning like it is unpredictable. If something's complicated, it's different from complex, right? Complication is just something that's really hard, but if you do it step by step, it's gonna work, right? Like if you like people have been putting rockets into space for over a century now. Is that true? No, under a century. And so, like putting together a rocket is incredibly complicated. But if you do it step by step, the way that other people have done it, you're gonna launch that thing. You know what I'm saying? But complex is like humans. They might have a different reaction to doing something that you intended, right? Like this is the essence of emotional, just emotions, right? Like if somebody's really upset about something, and you say hi to them, you're expecting the reaction of them to say hi back to you, but they're upset. You know what I mean? They have emotions. They're complex. It's not something that you could assume. You know what I mean? Unless they're like running around all grumpy and stuff. And so anyway, that's what I mean by complex. Like there's like things of it that are just kind of ambiguous. They're not actually clear, and there's no way to quantify it really. We just kind of need to be understand that we just need to work within that complexity. And so, anyway, when a worker looks at an organizational strategy, aka their own, they should have a very clear idea about the types of solutions that the leadership is interested in pursuing, right? So, if we're considering youth homelessness, well, you know, the examples I gave earlier is that one of the guiding policies might be committing extra staff members to this, even if it takes them away from important activities. So, if you want to build out a strong youth program and it's your priority, well, you might need to reallocate some of those staff and their time, right? So that whenever you look at that as an entry level staff or even a manager, you could say, okay, cool. I now have this guiding policy. I can move forward on this type of solution, taking this person and bringing them over here to focus on the youth stuff for a little bit, because this has been communicated from our leadership via this strategy, right? And so it gives people a clear option, because if they were under capacity for what they wanted to do, but there wasn't this guiding policy, it's like, well, the manager might just start taking on all the work. They might do overtime hours. They might try to look for grants so they can fill up a new position. Little did they know the leadership's actually okay with them just kind of like moving around some staff with as long as they have approval, right? So it's just so important to like get these things nailed down. So it shouldn't, and all this to say that it shouldn't be up to an entry level position to choose the direction. You know what I mean? Like it's up to the leadership to absorb the complexity and simplify it for them. Make it very clear this is what I want, and then they can action on it. All right. So last section here, coherent action. We're gonna land the plane now for this podcast. And so coherent actions give clear steps that can be carried out by all staff members at all levels. There's a good chance that strategy discussions end at the guiding policies, but a strategy is really about doing, right? We talked earlier about strategy as a form of problem solving, and solving problems contains actions. And so it doesn't need to be super detailed, like step by step, this is exactly what's going to happen, and then like the sector is going to react this way, and then we do this, but it needs to provide enough clarity for anyone reading it, namely the staff executing the strategy. Like there shouldn't there's always going to be more questions whenever you learn stuff, right? That's like the whole like fallacy of learning. But there should also be more. We should be answering as much as we can, and I think a good part of that, in like setting out these coherent actions, is also communicating what actions they don't want to be taken, right? So, that removing that ambiguity and making things clear is always going to be helpful for the entry level staff, because like decentralized um, um, like decision making like does happen all the time in organizations, like especially like managers, right? Like they don't need to receive direction from their boss just to like give direction to their team. um but like it's all about choice. And I think that the main impediment to action is the hope that the painful choices are going to go away, like um hey, like if you know like this, I don't think this happens like in strategy discussions, but it's like, we need to make a decision at some point about what's going to be prioritized, right? And that's where these coherent actions are really about. It's about like making it very clear that we don't want this, and these types of things. And if we do these actions, we're going to set ourselves up to leverage um, any sort of advantages they have, right? So, like once again, like going back to nonprofits and their lack of resources, like if you have very little resources, then you best be making these coherent actions or receiving these coherent actions to ensure that those resources are being spent in the best way possible, right? And so, strategy, really what it looks like from the outside and maybe even inside too, is that it's visible as coordinated action imposed on a system meaning like your team, right? If you're like a CEO, a director, a couple managers, and then some teams, like that centralized power coming from the leaders, the executive leadership team should be coming down through the organization, and be very clear and visible from the outside that like, there's some sort of flow. Maybe they can't like diligently put it together because that's just not people's priorities in life. But nonetheless, like if somebody was to be asked, what does your organization do and how do they do it? This strategy, if being moved forward on in like to standard, then people will be able to answer that very clearly for you. And I've certainly been in situations where I wasn't able to answer that clearly. So I want to avoid that for other people. And so in conclusion, youth reconciliation strategy is one form of strategy. And the better that we understand the fundamentals of strategy development, the better reconciliation strategies we can create. All right. And so we need to have practical approaches to solving complex problems and not accept taking it day by day, because you don't just wake up and move towards reconciliation. Like you need to have a coordinated approach. And so you need to coordinate with your community members, peers, your staff, and leadership needs to absorb the complexity of the situation and simplify the actions for everyone to understand. All right. So my call to action to y'all: sign up to my newsletter. It's in the description. It comes out every Tuesday, 2 weeks. I always give out free resources. Sometimes I like throw together some talking points, and it's all for free. Just subscribe, give me your email, and I am more than happy to provide you exclusive value about youth reconciliation strategy development directly to your email. All right, y'all. Miigwech, so happy to be back, and let me know if this podcast sounds better. I tried to like get closer to the mic this time, so we'll see. Peace.